I am 100 years old now, and when you live this long, you learn there are some truths that refuse to stay buried. They rise up in the quiet. They sit beside your bed in the middle of the night. They whisper your name until you are finally brave enough to speak them out loud. So today, I am going to tell you something I should have admitted decades ago. Something I wish someone had warned me about when I was still young enough to change the ending of my story. My husband's last words changed everything. But by the time they did, I had already wasted 41 years of the love he was trying to give me. His name was Robert Thompson. He was a quiet man with kind eyes and a patience that most people mistook for weakness. We married in 1948 in a small white church that smelled like lilies and floor polish. I was 22 years old and convinced I understood what marriage meant. I thought love was about loyalty, about staying, about building a life that looked respectable from the outside. And in many ways, we did build a life. We raised 2 daughters and a son. We moved from a cramped rental house to a modest home we were proud to call our own. We survived layoffs, illnesses, teenage rebellions, and all the ordinary storms that test a couple's commitment. If you had asked anyone in our neighborhood, they would have told you Robert and I were solid, dependable, the kind of marriage that lasted. But there is a difference between lasting and truly living together. Robert worked long hours as a mechanic. His hands were always rough, his shirts always carrying the faint scent of oil and metal. He missed school plays and anniversaries he later tried to make up for with awkward apologies and small gifts wrapped in newspaper. I told myself I understood. That sacrifice was part of being a good wife. Yet inside, I began to feel invisible. Instead of telling him how lonely I was, instead of asking him to meet me halfway, I started withdrawing, not dramatically, not in ways anyone else could see. I still cooked his meals, still ironed his shirts, still sat beside him in church every Sunday. But emotionally, I began closing doors. At first, it felt like self-protection, a quiet promise to myself that I would not keep hoping for more attention than he seemed able to give. I convinced myself that strong women did not need tenderness, that needing someone too much was a kind of weakness I could not afford. So I built walls, slowly, carefully, brick by brick, year by year. Robert kept trying to reach me, sometimes through clumsy jokes, sometimes through unexpected gestures like bringing home my favorite pie from the bakery across town. He would sit beside me on the porch after dinner, talking about his day in a voice that carried more longing than I recognized at the time, and I would nod without really listening. I told myself we were simply growing older, that passion fades, that distance is normal after decades together. I did not realize that what was fading was not love itself, but my willingness to receive it. When Robert retired, something changed in him. The urgency of providing was gone. The children were grown. For the first time, he had the space to focus on us. He began waking early just to make coffee before I came into the kitchen. He suggested evening walks. He reached for my hand in ways he had never done when we were younger. I remember how uncomfortable that made me feel. Instead of welcoming this softer version of my husband, I resented him for not being this way sooner. I told myself it was too late, that the years of feeling overlooked had hardened me beyond repair. What I did not understand then was that love was knocking again, and I was the one refusing to answer. One quiet October night, we sat together on the back porch watching the leaves fall. Robert looked at me with a sadness I had never seen before and said very gently, "Mildred, I've been trying to come back to you for a long time. I just wish you'd let me." A week later, he died in his sleep, and I have been living inside that sentence ever since. After Robert died, people kept telling me how blessed I was. Blessed to have had such a long marriage. Blessed to have someone who stayed. Blessed to reach old age with memories instead of scandals. I nodded and thanked them, because that is what polite women do. But inside, I felt like a fraud standing in borrowed clothes. Longevity is not the same thing as intimacy. 41 years can pass in the same house and still leave two hearts miles apart. The first weeks after the funeral moved like a slow fog. Our children filled the rooms with soft voices and practical kindness. They cooked meals, handled paperwork, hugged me with an urgency that told me they were afraid of what silence might do to me. When they finally returned to their own lives, the house became unbearably still. That was when I began noticing him everywhere, in the indentation his body had left on his side of the mattress, in the faint clink of tools in the garage when the wind rattled the shelves, in the way the kitchen clock seemed louder now, as if time itself were reminding me of everything I had postponed. Grief is not always loud. Sometimes it is a quiet realization that you can no longer fix what you misunderstood for years. One afternoon, while sorting through Robert's dresser drawers, I found a small spiral notebook tucked beneath his folded sweaters. I almost put it back. For most of our marriage, we had lived like courteous strangers sharing responsibilities. Curiosity about his inner world was not a habit I had cultivated, but something, perhaps guilt, perhaps love, finally waking up too late, made me open it. The first pages were simple lists, groceries, phone numbers, measurements for a repair he had planned in the garage. Then the writing changed. He had started using the notebook like a journal. I sat down on the edge of the bed and began to read words I should have heard years earlier. He wrote about watching me move through the house as if I were carrying invisible armor, about wondering when the laughter we once shared had become polite conversation, about feeling proud of the life we built and yet strangely lonely inside it. One entry made my hands tremble so badly I had to place the notebook on my lap. He wrote, "I don't think Mildred knows how much I still love her. I try in small ways, but she keeps stepping back like my affection is something dangerous. Maybe I hurt her more than I realized when we were young. Maybe I worked too much. I wish she would tell me how to fix it. I would do anything to feel close to her again." I had spent decades believing I was the only one carrying disappointment. Yet here was proof that the man beside me had been quietly questioning himself, quietly trying to earn back a version of my heart I had locked away without explanation. The memories began returning with painful clarity. Like the evening, he suggested we start taking walks after dinner. He said his doctor recommended exercise, but I could see he wanted conversation more than fresh air. I remember telling him I preferred to finish my television programs. He went alone that night, and the next. Eventually, he stopped asking. Or the Christmas when he bought me a record player because he remembered how much I loved music as a girl. Instead of gratitude, I felt resentment, a delayed attempt, I thought, to buy back the affection he had not given freely when I was younger. I thanked him politely, then rarely used it. Each small rejection seemed justified at the time. Together, they formed a pattern of quiet cruelty I did not recognize until I was living without him. Resentment is a slow poison. You sip it thinking it will protect you from future hurt, not realizing it is numbing your ability to receive joy in the present. Robert kept trying. That is what hurts the most to admit now. He never stormed out, never stopped providing, never humiliated me in ways the world would clearly condemn. He simply kept reaching, and I kept retreating. Toward the end of his life, he grew gentler, softer in a way that almost frightened me, as if time itself had sanded down his rough edges. He would sit beside me in the mornings, asking about my dreams, telling me stories from his childhood I had never bothered to learn before. I answered with brief smiles and distant eyes. I thought I had all the time in the world to reconnect. I did not know we were already standing at the edge of goodbye. There is one memory that returns to me more often than all the others. It arrives without warning, while I am folding laundry or staring out the window at a sky that feels too large for the life I have left. It was the year Robert turned 70. His hands had begun to stiffen from arthritis, and yet there was a new lightness in his step that I could not quite understand at the time. Retirement had given him something he had been missing his entire adult life: space. Space to think, space to feel, space to try again. He started talking about traveling, not in the grand, glamorous way some people dream of vacations, but with a quiet reverence, as if he were describing a pilgrimage. He had been researching our family history for months, sitting late at night at the kitchen table with old photographs spread around him like pieces of a puzzle. He traced names and dates with his finger, murmuring to himself as if he were listening for echoes. One evening he came to me with a folded brochure in his hand. His voice carried a hopeful excitement I had not heard since we were newlyweds. "Mildred," he said, "I found the town my grandfather came from. It's still there. Same coastline, same stone church. I thought, maybe we could go together, just once, before it's too late." I remember the way he stood there waiting for my answer, trying to appear calm while his eyes revealed how much the question mattered. And I remember how quickly I said no. I told him it was too expensive, too far, too inconvenient. I listed practical concerns like a lawyer presenting a case she had already decided to win. beneath all those reasons was a fear I could not name. The fear that sharing something so meaningful might break the walls I had spent decades constructing. If we stood together on that distant shore, if we held hands while looking out at the ocean his ancestors once crossed, I might have to admit that I still loved him deeply, and loving him meant risking disappointment again. So he went alone. He sent postcards written in careful, slanted handwriting, descriptions of cliffs covered in wild grass, of gray waves crashing against ancient rocks, of strangers who greeted him as if they somehow recognized him. One photograph showed him standing in front of a weathered stone chapel. His smile was soft, almost boyish, but there was also a loneliness in his posture that I did not want to see. I placed the postcards in a drawer and rarely opened it. When he returned home, he spoke less about his dreams. He still performed the rituals of our shared life, morning coffee, evening news, Sunday church, but something inside him had quieted. Not resentment, not anger, just a gentle surrender. Looking back now, I believe that trip was his final attempt to build a bridge between us. When I refused to cross it, he began learning how to live with the distance. The months that followed felt strangely peaceful on the surface. We did not argue. We did not accuse. We simply existed side by side like two old trees whose roots no longer intertwined. Then came that October evening on the porch. The air carried the scent of dry leaves and distant wood smoke. Robert sat beside me, watching the sky fade into a deepening blue. For a long time, he said nothing. I assumed he was tired. Finally, he turned to me, his voice almost a whisper. "I've been trying to come home to you," he said, "for years now. I just wish you'd open the door." I felt a flicker of discomfort, not understanding, not compassion, just a vague irritation at being confronted with emotions I had spent a lifetime avoiding. I stood up and told him I needed to check on the laundry. That was the last real conversation we ever had. A week later, he went to bed and never woke up. At his funeral, people praised his devotion. They spoke about how lucky I was to have shared such a long marriage. I stood there accepting their sympathy, realizing with a clarity that felt like a blade that I had mistaken endurance for intimacy. He had spent his final years knocking gently on a door I refused to unlock, and now that door stands open in a house where he will never walk again. After Robert's funeral, the days began to stretch in a way I had never experienced before. Time did not move forward anymore. It simply expanded, filling every corner of the house with echoes. I would wake before sunrise out of habit, expecting to hear the soft shuffle of his slippers across the kitchen floor. Instead, there was only silence, thick and unfamiliar, like a stranger sitting at my table. It was during those early mornings that the weight of everything I had refused to see finally settled on my shoulders, not all at once. Understanding rarely comes like lightning. It comes like dawn, slow, unavoidable, illuminating details you once preferred to keep hidden in shadow. I began opening drawers I had ignored for years, Sorting through his belongings felt like reading a language I should have learned long ago. Inside his desk, I found more of his writing, loose pages folded carefully, as if he never intended anyone else to read them, but could not bring himself to throw them away. One page in particular changed something inside me. He had written about an ordinary Tuesday, about watching me stand at the sink washing dishes while sunlight spilled across the floor. He described the curve of my shoulders, the familiar rhythm of my movements, the way he still felt a quiet gratitude just to share a home with me. Then he wrote a sentence that made my breath catch. I don't think she knows she still has my whole heart. I would give anything just to make her smile the way she used to. For decades, I had convinced myself that he stopped loving me the way he once did, that his long hours at work were proof I was not his priority, that his awkward attempts at closeness later in life were simply guilt or obligation. But here was the truth in his own handwriting. He had never stopped loving me. I was the one who had slowly withdrawn from the warmth he kept offering. Memories began resurfacing with painful precision. The night he surprised me with tickets to a small concert in town because he remembered how much I adored live music when we were young. I had complained about the traffic, about the crowd, about the discomfort of sitting for hours. We left early. I told myself he should have known better. Or the afternoon he fixed the loose step on our front porch without being asked, then stood there waiting for me to notice. When I finally did, I simply nodded and went back inside. I see now that he was not seeking praise for carpentry. He was seeking connection, so many moments like that. Tiny openings in the walls I had built, openings I chose to seal instead of step through. The cruelest part is that I truly believed I was protecting myself. In my younger years, I had felt unseen, unappreciated, left alone with responsibilities while he worked himself into exhaustion. Instead of expressing that hurt honestly, I let it harden into a quiet bitterness that shaped the woman I became. By the time he finally had the freedom to give me the attention I once longed for, I no longer trusted the possibility of happiness. Disappointment had become familiar. Resentment had become safe. It is strange how the human heart can cling to pain simply because it is predictable. In his last year, Robert developed a habit of sitting beside me in the evenings, sometimes without speaking at all. He would rest his hand lightly on the arm of my chair, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his presence, but not so close that it demanded a response. At the time, I interpreted that quiet as weakness. Now I understand it was patience, a gentle persistence born from decades of loving someone who kept moving just out of reach. One night, after we had watched the news in silence, he said softly, "Do you ever miss us, the way we used to be?" I shrugged and told him people change, that life moves on. What I meant was that I was afraid to revisit a version of myself who still believed in effortless closeness. Admitting I missed that too would have required me to acknowledge how much distance I had helped create. When he spoke his final words on the porch about trying to come home to me, I thought he was being sentimental. I did not realize he was offering me one last invitation, one final chance to lower the walls and meet him where he stood. I chose chores over connection, practicality over vulnerability, habit over love. That is the part of my story that still keeps me awake at night. Not that he died. Death comes for all of us eventually. But that in the days when he was most ready to be fully present with me, I was the one who remained absent. Now I sit with the understanding that a marriage can endure for decades while the deeper intimacy quietly fades. And sometimes, by the time you finally notice what has been lost, the person who was willing to rebuild it is already gone. At 100 years old, you begin to see life with a kind of clarity that feels almost cruel. There is no longer any rush, no illusions about endless tomorrows, no comforting belief that you can fix everything later. Later becomes a word that loses its meaning when most of your story has already been written. I spend many afternoons now sitting by the window in this quiet room, watching younger families come and go in the courtyard below. I see husbands carrying grocery bags, wives adjusting scarves around their children's necks, couples arguing softly about directions or dinner plans. Ordinary moments, the kind I once believed would always be waiting for me, what I would give to return to those simple days. People imagine that reaching old age brings wisdom like a reward. The truth is, wisdom often arrives wrapped in regret. It comes from finally understanding the cost of the choices you made when you still had time to choose differently. I have replayed Robert's last words in my mind thousands of times, not because I enjoy the pain, but because they contain a lesson I wish someone had forced me to learn sooner. I've been trying to come home to you. He was not asking for perfection. He was not demanding grand gestures or dramatic apologies. He was asking for access, for emotional openness, for the simple grace of being allowed back into a heart that had quietly closed its doors. And I was too proud, too guarded, too accustomed to disappointment to recognize the gift he was offering. If there is one thing I have learned from wasting 41 years behind invisible walls, it is this: love does not survive on endurance alone. It requires participation. It requires humility. It requires the courage to be soft again, even after you have been hurt. So many people believe relationships end because of betrayal or cruelty or dramatic failures. Sometimes they do, but more often they fade because of neglect, because of conversations that never happen, because of affection that is withheld out of habit, because two people slowly become strangers while still sharing the same last name. I look at the photograph on my bedside table, the one taken on our wedding day. Robert's arm is wrapped around my waist, his smile wide and certain. I am leaning into him without fear, without calculation. That young woman had no idea how skilled she would become at pretending she did not need the man beside her. If I could speak to her now, I would tell her that strength is not found in emotional distance. Real strength is found in vulnerability, in saying, "I am hurt," instead of building a wall, in saying, I still need you, instead of pretending independence is the same as peace. To anyone listening to my story, please understand this. Time is not as generous as it feels when you are young. You think there will always be another chance to say the kind words, to take the walk, to accept the invitation, to hold the hand reaching quietly for yours. One day, there won't be. You will look across an empty room and realize that the arguments you avoided were never as dangerous as the silence you allowed to grow. You will understand that protecting yourself from pain also protected you from joy, and you will wish, with a longing that settles deep into your bones, that you had chosen connection while it was still possible. My husband's last words changed everything, but only because they forced me to see the truth I had been running from for most of my life. 41 years is a long time to misunderstand love. A lifetime, really. I cannot go back and open the door I kept closed. I cannot take that trip with him or dance in the living room or sit beside him on the porch with the tenderness he deserved. All I can do now is offer this story like a warning light in the distance. If someone in your life is still knocking gently on your heart, open it. Do not wait until memory is the only place left where love can live. Choose warmth over pride. Choose presence over old wounds. Choose to come home to each other while there is still time to do so.